There's talk online that the U.S. is preparing to send Tomahawk missiles, weapons once designed to carry nuclear warheads, to Ukraine. Some call it a turning point, others call it madness. If that were true, it could redraw every red line in the war. But is it real, or just another wave of noise designed to keep the world on edge? In the past few days, online discussions have exploded around one headline: reports that Washington might be preparing to send Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, weapons capable of striking deep inside Russian territory. For many, that sounds like the moment when the war crosses its final red line, the step before a nuclear escalation. But as always, between discussion and decision, there's an entire world of difference. In this video, we'll verify what's actually true. We'll see which missiles are really on the table, what their deployment would change on the battlefield, how Moscow might respond, and why some voices are amplifying a danger that, while real, isn't as imminent as it sounds. Because understanding what's true, instead of chasing panic, is the only way to measure how close we actually are to the edge of escalation. If you want serious analysis built on facts, not fear, subscribe. Let's start with what's actually known, not what's been claimed. In Washington, a small group of senators and defense officials have reportedly discussed the idea of adding Tomahawk cruise missiles to a future aid package for Ukraine. The conversation was described as exploratory, not operational. There's no executive order, no signed transfer, and no deployment underway. What exists right now is a policy debate, one of many inside a system that constantly evaluates how far it can go without crossing its own red lines. Still, the word Tomahawk carries weight. It's not just another missile. It's an icon of American power projection. Capable of flying more than 1,000 miles with precision, it has been used in every major U.S. conflict since the Gulf War. And in its early variants, it could carry nuclear warheads. That nuclear version, known as the TLAMN, was retired more than a decade ago under the Obama administration. The current Tomahawks are strictly conventional, designed for precision strikes against infrastructure, command centers, and air defenses. But in geopolitics, what a weapon is matters less than what it represents. To Moscow, a Tomahawk doesn't just mean a missile, it means American reach, and a symbol of how close U.S. firepower could get to Russian soil. So even the discussion of transferring such weapons sets off alarms in the Kremlin. The Russian Foreign Ministry immediately labeled the reports a direct provocation, while state media warned that it would change the nature of the conflict. This reaction isn't entirely surprising. The Tomahawk sits in a category of weapons that blur the line between tactical and strategic, not because of their payload, but because of their range. From Moscow's perspective, giving Ukraine the ability to strike deep inside Russian territory is almost indistinguishable from a U.S. intervention itself. And that perception, the psychological side of deterrence, is where the danger lies. Every conflict runs on two levels: what happens on the battlefield and what each side believes is happening. When those beliefs start to diverge, even a rumor can shift the balance. That's why this story spread so fast. It touched the raw nerve of escalation, even without a single missile being moved. The truth, for now, is simple but volatile. The Tomahawks haven't been sent, and may never be. Yet the fact that their name alone is enough to rattle both governments shows how fragile the current balance has become. Because in 2025, the distance between a debate in Washington and a threat perceived in Moscow can be measured in minutes. And sometimes, that's all it takes for tension to turn into crisis. So what exactly is this missile that's causing so much noise? The Tomahawk is one of the most recognizable weapons in the U.S. arsenal. A long-range cruise missile capable of striking targets more than 1,500 kilometers away, roughly the distance from Kyiv to Moscow. It's launched from ships or submarines, travels close to the ground to avoid radar detection, and hits with remarkable precision. But despite what many posts online suggest, it no longer carries nuclear warheads. Those versions were retired years ago. Every Tomahawk currently in service is conventional, designed to destroy infrastructure, air defenses, or command centers with a high explosive payload. If Ukraine were ever to receive them, the impact wouldn't come from what the missiles could physically destroy, but from what their presence would symbolize. It would mark the first time Kyiv possessed a truly long-range strike capability, a tool that could reach deep into Russian territory, far beyond the front lines. For Ukraine, it would mean leverage, the ability to hit back against missile launch sites, supply hubs, or even logistics chains that Moscow has so far considered untouchable. For Russia, it would mean vulnerability, and in military psychology, perception is everything. The Kremlin's doctrine, often summarized as the security perimeter, is built on the belief that Russia's borders must be surrounded by layers of defense and distance. It's not just about geography, it's about psychology. The idea that Western-made missiles could suddenly erase that buffer challenges one of the pillars of how Russia sees its own survival. That's why even the suggestion of tomahawks in Ukrainian hands triggers such an intense reaction in Moscow's rhetoric. But this is where nuance matters. The tomahawk doesn't magically change the war. Ukraine already has long-range capabilities. British Storm Shadow and French Scalp missiles can reach targets hundreds of kilometers away, and they've already struck inside Russia-controlled areas. What makes the tomahawk different is its association. It's American. It's strategic. It's a weapon that, for decades, has been used only by the United States and its closest allies. Its presence would be read not as a tactical upgrade, but as a political statement. The West is willing to cross another invisible line. That's why even if the missile itself is conventional, the reaction around it feels nuclear. It blurs the space between conventional deterrence and existential fear. And in a war where every signal is read for hidden meaning, perception can matter more than payload. Because in the end, the tomahawk's power isn't just in what it can hit, it's in what it makes others believe is now possible. Following the reports, Moscow wasted no time in issuing its response. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov warned that any deployment of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine would be viewed as an act of direct aggression by the United States. Russian state television filled its evening programs with dramatic graphics of missile flight paths reaching Russian cities. It's the same script we've seen before, strong words meant to draw new red lines before they're crossed. But history shows that these threats are as much about shaping perception as about signaling real intent. When the U.S. first sent HIMARS rocket systems to Ukraine, Russia warned that their use would bring unpredictable consequences. Then came the British Storm Shadow and French Scalp missiles, followed by the promise of F-16 fighter jets. Each time, Moscow's language was apocalyptic. Each time, it eventually adapted. None of those moments triggered the nuclear retaliation that Russian officials claimed was possible. That doesn't mean the danger is imaginary. It means the rhetoric itself is a tool. Russia's strategy of deterrence relies heavily on communication as a weapon. The constant invocation of red lines is designed to deter the West without forcing Moscow into escalation it may not actually want. By keeping its responses ambiguous, the Kremlin preserves flexibility. It can appear defiant to its domestic audience while still avoiding a direct confrontation it might not be ready to fight. But this balancing act has limits. Each time the West introduces a new system, whether HIMARS, Storm Shadow, or now potentially Tomahawk, it chips away at the credibility of those warnings. And when deterrence by rhetoric starts to fail, the only way to restore it is through action. That's where the real danger lies. Because deterrence is psychological before it's military. It depends on fear, and fear fades with repetition. If Moscow starts to believe that Washington no longer takes its threats seriously, it may feel compelled to prove them. Not necessarily through a nuclear strike, but through a visible, dramatic escalation. Larger attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, cyber offensives against Western networks, or dangerous intercepts of NATO aircraft. That's what worries Western analysts the most. Not a deliberate nuclear launch, but a miscalculated demonstration. An attempt to reassert credibility that spirals into something no one planned. Moscow's words may sound like theater, but they're part of a very deliberate performance, a show of strength designed to mask deep insecurity. And the more isolated Russia becomes, economically, politically, and strategically, the more unpredictable that performance could get. Because when a superpower begins to doubt its own deterrence, it doesn't go silent. It raises its voice. While Moscow raises its voice, Washington speaks in careful tones. Inside the U.S. government, the idea of sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine has divided opinion across the political and military spectrum. On one side, hawks in Congress and parts of the Pentagon argue that strengthening Ukraine's long-range strike capability is essential, that every delay helps Russia rebuild, regroup, and push further. They see escalation not as a danger, but as the necessary cost of deterrence. Their logic is straightforward. If Moscow only respects strength, then showing restraint invites more aggression. On the other side are officials, diplomats, and intelligence analysts who warn that certain lines, especially those involving weapons that can reach deep into Russia, carry unpredictable consequences. They point out that it's one thing to hit targets in occupied Ukraine and another to strike across internationally recognized Russian territory. That's the threshold where a proxy war starts looking like direct confrontation. The Pentagon's position reflects this tension. It understands that every new capability sent to Kiev doesn't just shift the battlefield, it shifts the political narrative. The weapons themselves become messages. HIMARS meant, "We'll help you defend." Storm Shadow meant, "We'll help you hit back." Tomahawks, if ever approved, would mean, "We're ready to reach further." And each message has to be calibrated not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for allies in Europe and audiences at home. That's why officials describe the discussion as delicate, under review, or subject to further assessment. These aren't evasions, they're signals of how tight the margin has become. Washington knows that one system too powerful, one range too long, could turn a proxy conflict into a direct standoff. So rather than rushing a decision, the administration often lets the idea itself do the work. Floating a proposal through the media without confirming or denying it is a diplomatic tactic as old as the Cold War. It's called signaling through ambiguity. By letting the story circulate, Washington gets to watch how Moscow, Beijing, and European allies react without committing to anything. The leak becomes a tool of strategy. And that's likely what's happening here. Talking about Tomahawks may be less about preparing shipments and more about testing nerves. It lets the U.S. measure how far Russia's red lines have eroded and how willing its partners are to push them. In diplomacy, sometimes the loudest move is the one that never actually happens. Because in Washington, words can travel as far as missiles, and often with the same purpose, to shape behavior before a single launch ever takes place. And this is where the story takes its most dangerous turn, not on the battlefield, but in the information space. Because while officials in Washington speak cautiously and Moscow threatens predictably, the online world has already declared that the missiles are flying and the countdown to nuclear war has begun. Across social media, titles scream, "U.S. goes nuclear on Russia," "Tomahawks inbound," "World War III imminent." Videos rack up millions of views, blending partial truths with outright invention. What began as a policy discussion becomes a spectacle, and in the process, it warps public perception. The problem isn't just misinformation, it's the emotional economy that drives it. Fear is profitable. It generates clicks, shares, and engagement in a way that careful analysis never can. And once fear takes hold, it spreads faster than any fact check. The more audiences are conditioned to expect the worst, the easier it becomes for bad actors, state or private, to manipulate that fear for their own agendas. In the context of a nuclear-armed standoff, this distortion has real consequences. When people are convinced that the war is already here, they begin to normalize escalation. Calls for diplomacy are dismissed as weakness. Every headline becomes proof that the other side has already crossed the line. In that environment, restraint looks like surrender, and caution like cowardice. That's how wars of perception begin, long before any shot is fired. And the danger doesn't stop there. Disinformation doesn't just create panic among citizens, it also pressures policymakers. Governments are made up of people who read the same headlines, face the same outrage, and feel the same public anxiety. When leaders sense that their populations expect decisive, even reckless responses, the political space for negotiation shrinks. Escalation stops being a military choice and starts being a domestic necessity. That's why responsible communication matters as much as deterrence itself. Panic is a weapon, not just for propaganda, but for policy. When entire societies are convinced they're standing on the edge of nuclear conflict, their leaders are pushed closer to making it real. So when we separate fact from hype, it's not just an exercise in accuracy, it's an act of stability. Because every exaggerated headline, every viral rumor, every breaking alert that feeds hysteria does what missiles alone can't. It erodes calm, the one resource every side desperately needs to avoid catastrophe. Fear, once unleashed, doesn't need war to destroy, it just needs attention. After cutting through the noise, what remains is not just a debate about one missile system, it's about perception and the fragile balance that perception creates. Every new weapon in a war like this carries two payloads, one explosive, the other psychological. Moscow fears vulnerability, Washington fears losing credibility, and Kyiv fears running out of time. Each side moves to protect what it believes keeps it safe, and that belief itself becomes the battlefield. For Russia, the prospect of American-made Tomahawks in Ukrainian hands isn't just a tactical problem, it's a symbolic one. It signals that Western resolve hasn't weakened, that the United States and NATO are still willing to push the boundaries of support. In the Kremlin's logic, that undermines deterrence, because deterrence depends on convincing the other side that you still have control. Once that perception cracks, the fear of appearing weak can drive more aggressive behavior than actual weakness ever would. For Washington, the dilemma is inverted. America's global credibility rests on consistency, the idea that when it draws a line, it will defend it. But credibility can become a trap. If every new escalation requires an even bolder response to maintain that image, deterrence becomes self-consuming. The risk is not that the U.S. won't act, it's that it might feel it has to, even when prudence would suggest restraint. And for Ukraine, caught between these two imperatives, the calculus is painfully simple: survival. Every day that passes without long-range weapons means more pressure on its defenses, more losses on the ground, more fatigue among its population. To Kyiv, the moral equation is straightforward. When your cities are bombed daily, escalation feels like self-defense. The danger lies in the intersection of these fears. History shows that wars rarely explode because someone wants them to. They ignite when leaders misread intentions, when one side interprets hesitation as weakness or a warning as aggression. The Cuban Missile Crisis nearly became nuclear, not because either side sought destruction, but because they misjudged how far the other was willing to go. That was 1962, when communications took hours and humans still had time to think. In 2025, that margin has vanished. Early warning systems are automated, command decisions rely on algorithms, and false alarms travel faster than diplomacy. The next misunderstanding might unfold not over days, but over minutes, too fast for reason to intervene. That's what makes perception the real weapon of this century. It fires instantly, and once launched, it's almost impossible to recall. So when we talk about Tomahawks, we're not really talking about hardware. We're talking about the invisible network of assumptions, fears, and calculations that keeps the modern world from tearing itself apart. And in that system, the most dangerous missile is still the one fired by mistake. And so we come full circle. The debate over Tomahawks, the rhetoric from Moscow, the noise online, they all belong to the same silent war, the war of balance. In the nuclear age, balance isn't measured in warheads or ranges. It's measured in perception, in who looks like they still have control. Every new announcement, every delivery, every headline becomes a move in a psychological chess game where the board is global and every piece matters. The possibility of sending Tomahawks to Ukraine, or even just talking about it, is part of that game. It's not only a military signal, it's a calibration of willpower. For Washington, it's a reminder that the West isn't stepping back. For Moscow, it's a test of how far it can be pushed before it pushes back. For everyone else, it's a mirror reflecting how fragile stability has become. The paradox of deterrence is that the very tools meant to prevent catastrophe also bring us closer to it. No one wants nuclear war, not in the Kremlin, not in the Pentagon, not in Kiev. But everyone invokes it because fear is part of strategy. It's what keeps deterrence alive and diplomacy possible. Yet that same fear is corrosive. It builds pressure, amplifies mistrust, and narrows the space for reason. The line between maintaining balance and losing control is thinner than ever, and it runs not through missile silos or command centers, but through perception itself. The real question then isn't whether the U.S. will send Tomahawks. It's how long the world can keep playing with tension before tension starts playing with the world. Because history doesn't just remember decisions, it remembers mistakes. The First World War began with one misread telegram. The Cuban Missile Crisis nearly ended civilization because of one misunderstood order. And today, with information moving faster than thought, the margin for error is vanishing. That's why clarity, not noise, is power. Understanding what's real and what's merely performed is no longer a luxury, it's a safeguard. Because in an age where every word can move markets, armies, or alliances, truth itself becomes part of the defense system. So when the headlines scream and the rumors spread, remember, the quietest voices often hold the most weight. Silence in diplomacy doesn't mean absence, it means calculation. And for now, that silence is the only thing keeping the balance intact. But like every weapon ever built, even silence comes with an expiration date. The question is, what breaks first, the balance, or our ability to see it for what it really is? If you want analysis that cuts through the noise, that looks past the headlines and focuses on what's real,